My name is John. I'm 58 years old. And with these two hands, the same hands that once folded in prayer, the same hands that helped build the new parish hall, I tossed my grandmother's rosary into a fire pit. I stood there in my own backyard, the smell of lighter fluid thick in the autumn air, and I watched the plastic beads worn smooth by her fingers and mine begin to melt and curl. I watched the silver crucifix, the one she'd kissed 1,000 times, turn black with soot. And I did it all while recording on my phone, my face set like stone, broadcasting my own blasphemy for the whole town to see. This wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a declaration. That was me. A man so consumed by pride, it was bigger than the cathedral I'd spent my entire life helping to fund. Before I go on, before I take you into the heart of that fire and the darkness that followed, I want to ask you something. If this story, even just the beginning of it, is speaking to you in some way, if it resonates in that quiet place where we all keep our own struggles, I'd ask you to take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Click the like button and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. And in the comments, I'd be honored if you'd just tell me where you're watching from. It helps me to know that we're all in this together, from every corner of the world. It means a lot. Now, to understand why a man like me would do something so monstrous, you have to understand the man I was. I wasn't born a monster. I was born into the faith. Grew up right here in this town, baptized in the same font as my father and his father before him. My life was built on the bedrock of the St. Jude parish. My weeks were measured by Sundays. My year was marked by Easter, Christmas, and the annual Knights of Columbus fish fry. I was the Grand Knight for 15 years. I wore that title like a badge of honor. It meant something. It meant I was a pillar, a man of substance, a guardian of tradition. My wife, Sarah, and I, we raised our kids in the second pew from the front on the right. Every single Sunday. My faith wasn't abstract, it was brick and mortar. It was the weight of the collection basket in my hand, the smell of old wood and incense, the familiar cadence of the Mass. It was order. It was legacy. My pride wasn't just arrogance, it was a fierce, protective love for what my family had built. My grandfather helped lay the foundation of the old church. My father chaired the committee that built the school. And me? I made sure the parish never wanted for anything. When the roof leaked, I was the first to write a check. When the food pantry ran low, my truck was the one that showed up with a bed full of groceries. I saw myself as a caretaker of a legacy, and I took that job very, very seriously. My faith was strong, but it was rigid. It was my way, the old way, the right way. And I had little patience for anything or anyone that challenged it. The conflict, the crack in my foundation started quietly. It started with the retirement of our old priest, a man I'd known my whole life, and the arrival of a new one, Father Michael. He couldn't have been more than 30. He had new ideas, a guitar, and a way of talking about faith that felt flimsy to me. He spoke of faith as a journey, a conversation. I saw it as a fortress, a set of rules. We were cordial, but there was an ocean between us. Then came the proposal. For my parents' 50th anniversary, I wanted to donate a new stained glass window to the church, a grand traditional piece depicting the Assumption of Mary. It was more than just a window. It was a monument to my family's devotion, a permanent mark of the legacy I was so proud of. It was my name, our name, etched into the very fabric of the church for generations to see. I presented the plans to him in his office, my chest puffed out with a sense of purpose. I had the designs, the quotes, the checkbook ready. He looked over the papers, a polite smile on his face. He listened patiently. And then he said the words that lit the fuse. "John," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "it's a beautiful gesture, truly, but I think the parish's resources and your generosity could be better used elsewhere. We need to look forward. This feels, well, it feels like a monument to the past. A monument to the past." He said it so casually, as if he were discussing the weather, but to me, he might as well have taken a sledgehammer to my family's headstone. My entire life, My family's entire contribution dismissed, turned to dust by a kid who hadn't even been born when I was leading fundraising drives. The heat rose in my neck. The room felt small. I saw my father's face, my grandmother's hands clutching her rosary, and I felt a rage so pure, so white-hot it was blinding. He wasn't just rejecting a window, he was rejecting me. He was erasing me. That evening, the rage didn't cool. It festered. It became a poison. I walked through my house, a stranger in my own life. Sarah tried to talk to me, but I couldn't hear her. All I could hear were his words, a monument to the past. That night, I went into the drawer where my grandmother's things were kept, and I took out her rosary. The beads were cool in my hand, a familiar comfort that now felt like a lie. This symbol, this thing she held on to through sickness and sorrow, what was it worth if the very institution it represented could cast me aside so easily? The thought was an ugly one, but it took root. If they were going to erase me, I would erase them first. I would burn the most sacred thing I owned. I walked out to the backyard, to the fire pit we used for family gatherings. I grabbed the can of lighter fluid. I propped my phone against a rock, hit record and aimed the camera at my own face. I wanted them to see me. I wanted the whole town, the whole parish, Father Michael, everyone, to see the face of the man they had broken. And then I held up the rosary, said my piece and let it fall into the flames. The video was on the town Facebook group before the fire was even out. My sister Mary called me sobbing. Sarah just stood at the back door, her face a mask of horror and grief, and said nothing at all. The silence was worse than any scream. I had burned my bridge to God, and I was about to find out what it felt like to be stranded on the other side. The silence that followed was a physical thing. It filled the rooms of my house, heavier than any sound I'd ever known. Sarah didn't yell, she didn't cry in front of me. She just stopped. She moved around me like I was a ghost, her eyes looking through me, not at me. The warmth we had built over 35 years of marriage, it just vanished. Our home became a cold, quiet tomb, and I was the one who had killed the life in it. My sister Mary called me, her voice ragged with weeping. "John, what have you done? Take it down, please, just take it down." But I couldn't. The pride was like a cancer now. It had its own life, its own will. Admitting I was wrong felt like dying. At church that Sunday, our pew, the second from the front on the right, was empty for the first time in my adult life. I heard later from my brother-in-law that people didn't know where to look. My absence was a shout. The video had done exactly what I wanted it to do. It had fractured our little world. It had drawn a line in the sand, and I stood alone on my side, king of a kingdom of ash. For a few days, I lived on that anger. It was fuel. I'd wake up in the morning, the cold space in the bed beside me a fresh reminder, and the rage would be there, waiting. I'd go to work at the construction company I owned, barking orders, finding fault in everything. My men, guys I'd known for decades, started avoiding me. I was a storm cloud in a hard hat, and no one wanted to be caught in the rain. I told myself I was justified. They had pushed me out, so I would show them how little I needed them. I didn't need their church, their New Age priest, their flimsy guitar-strumming faith. I had built my own life with my own two hands. I was self-made. I was strong. I was a fool. It was a Tuesday afternoon, grey and threatening rain. I'd had a fight with my foreman, a ridiculous argument over nothing, and I stormed out of the office. I couldn't go home to the silence. I couldn't stand the sight of my own four walls. So I did what I always did when the world got too small. I got on my motorcycle. It was a big, loud Harley, chrome and black, the very picture of American pride. For me, that bike was control. The roar of the engine drowned out the noise in my head. The speed was a temporary escape. I didn't have a destination. I just drove heading west out of town onto the old country roads that snake through the farmland. The wind was cold, biting at the exposed skin on my face, but I pushed the throttle harder, faster. I was running, you see, running from Sarah's silent judgment, from Mary's tears, from the empty space in that church pew. But mostly, I was running from the hollow, aching void that had opened up inside me. I remember the road. I remember the smell of damp earth and diesel. I remember the blur of the trees, the grey sky pressing down. The rage was still there, a hot coil in my gut. I was replaying the conversation with Father Michael, the fire pit, the look on Sarah's face. Every wrong, real and imagined, was a fresh log on the fire. I was so lost in my own righteous anger that I didn't see the curve until I was already in it. It was a blind curve, a sharp right-hander, hidden by a thicket of old oaks. I was going too fast, way too fast. As I leaned into the turn, my back tire skidded on a patch of wet leaves. For a split second, time stretched. I felt the loss of traction, the sickening slide of the bike out from under me. And then, headlights, a pickup truck, coming the other way, right in its lane. The driver's face a perfect cameo of shock. There was no time to think, no time to pray, no time to do anything but brace for the inevitable. The impact was an explosion of sound and force. Metal screamed against metal. I was thrown from the bike, a rag doll tossed into the air. I remember the sky, grey and indifferent, tumbling over and over. And then the ground, which came up to meet me with a violence that felt personal, absolute. There was a sickening crunch of bone, a white-hot flash of pain that consumed my entire being, and then a strange, floating darkness. I was lying on the cold, wet asphalt, my body a ruin of twisted limbs. I could hear a faint, high-pitched ringing in my ears. I tried to move, but nothing responded. The pain was a living thing, a fire that burned in every nerve. But underneath it was something far worse, a profound, terrifying stillness. In that moment, all the pride, all the anger, it was just gone, burned away by the agony, and in its place was a fear so pure, so cold, it was all I was. I was going to die, here, on this lonely road. My last act on earth, a monument to my own bitterness. I tried to call on God, the God of my childhood, the God of rules and order. I formed a prayer in my mind, a desperate plea. But the line was dead. There was no answer, just the ringing in my ears and the cold seeping up from the pavement. I was utterly, completely alone. It's hard to describe the feeling of reaching for something that has been the bedrock of your entire life, only to find nothing but empty space. If this story is touching something in you, if you've ever felt that kind of emptiness, I hope you'll stick with me to see what filled it. Please take a second to hit the like button and make sure you've turned on notifications, because you won't want to miss what happened next, lying there on that road. I don't know how much time passed. Lying on that road, I was aware of sensations in flashes. The cold, the distant wail of a siren, the gentle but firm hands of a paramedic cutting away my leather jacket. Then nothing. I wasn't in my body anymore. I was adrift in an ocean of quiet grey. There was no pain, but there was no peace either. Just a profound and endless emptiness. It was the silence of my own house, magnified 1,000,000 times. It was the silence of a dead phone line to God. I thought, so this is it. This is what I chose. The void. The beeping of machines was a distant, rhythmic pulse, a soundtrack to my own fading existence. It was a symphony of dread, each beep a countdown to the final, flat note. And I floated in that cold fog, a disembodied regret, knowing I had earned this. My pride had been a fortress, and now its walls had crumbled, leaving me exposed in this desolate landscape of my own making. Then, through the grey, a warmth began to spread. It wasn't a light at the end of a tunnel. It was more like the dawn breaking on a day you thought would never come. And in the heart of that gentle light, I saw a woman. I couldn't make out her features, not clearly. Her face was a soft focus of compassion, as if looking directly at her would be too much for a soul like mine to bear. But I knew her, in the deepest part of me, in a place untouched by anger and pride. I knew her. She didn't speak a word. She didn't need to. Her presence was a language all its own, and it spoke of a mercy so absolute, so unconditional, it shattered the last remnants of my defiance. I felt myself being lifted, cradled. The brokenness of my body, the jagged edges of my spirit. None of it mattered to her. She held me not as a judge would hold a sinner, but as a mother would hold a lost and injured child who had finally come home. The pain, the fear, the crushing weight of my loneliness, it all just dissolved in her embrace. It wasn't forgiveness in the sense of a slate being wiped clean. It was something deeper. It was a love that saw the filth, the soot, the ugly scar of my sin, and loved me anyway. And as she held me, I saw what was in her hands. It was a rosary, but not just any rosary. It was mine, the one I had thrown into the fire. But it wasn't blackened or melted. It was perfect, restored. The silver crucifix didn't just shine. It seemed to be the source of the warmth that filled the void. And the beads glowed with a soft internal light, each one a perfect, luminous pearl. It was my act of hatred, transformed into an instrument of grace. It was the ugliest thing I had ever done, made beautiful. She held it out, not to me, but as if to show me that it was still there, that what I had tried to destroy in my rage, she had preserved in her love. Each bead of light was an anchor, and I felt the weight of it pulling me back from the edge of that endless grey sea. In that moment, shame washed over me in a wave so powerful it felt like it would drown me. But it wasn't a destructive shame. It was a cleansing fire. I saw my life with a horrifying clarity. I saw the man in the video, his face contorted with pride, and I wept for him. I saw Sarah's face at the door, her heart breaking in silence, and my own heart broke with it. I saw the empty pew, the confusion in the faces of my friends, the scandal I had caused. I saw it all, and the weight of it was unbearable. But as I felt this crushing repentance, her presence only grew stronger, her embrace more certain. She wasn't there to condemn me for what I had done, but to welcome the man I could become. She was showing me that the path back wasn't closed. The bridge I had burned was being rebuilt, right there in the darkness, bead by glowing bead. The next thing I knew, the grey fog was receding. The distant beeping of the machines grew louder, sharper, more insistent. A different kind of light, harsh and fluorescent, burned against my eyelids. I felt a scratchy blanket against my skin. I could smell the antiseptic cleanness of a hospital room. I opened my eyes. Sarah was there, asleep in a chair beside the bed, her face pale and etched with worry lines I had put there. A nurse was checking my IV. I was back. I was alive. Later, the doctors would come in, shaking their heads. They'd show me x-rays that looked like a jigsaw puzzle someone had dropped. They used words like miraculous, inexplicable, shouldn't have survived. They talked about the surgeries, the pins, the plates. But they couldn't explain why there was no brain damage, no spinal injury, no permanent paralysis. They called it luck, but I knew better. It wasn't luck. It was grace. It was a mother who had refused to let her foolish child wander off into the dark for good. And I knew with a certainty that was now the new bedrock of my life what I had to do first. The journey back from that place is a story in itself, a testament to a mercy I will never fully comprehend. If this moment of grace, this impossible rescue, has given you even a sliver of hope, I'd be grateful if you'd let me know by hitting that like button, and make sure you turn on your notifications, because you'll want to see what happened when I asked Sarah to go back to our house and bring me a small charred box of ashes. Waking up in that hospital bed was like being born into two different worlds at once. There was the world of beeping machines, of nurses with kind but tired eyes, of the dull, throbbing ache in my leg and ribs that reminded me with every breath that I was made of fragile bone and flesh. It was a world of charts and numbers, of physical therapy schedules and the metallic taste of medication. It was the real world, the logical world, the world that my old self, the John who ran the numbers and trusted only what he could build or buy, understood completely. But then there was the other world, the memory. It wasn't fuzzy like a dream. It was more real, more solid than the steel pins holding my femur together. The warmth of that embrace, the unconditional peace that came from the woman in the light. It was a memory that had been branded onto my soul, and so the battle began right there in that sterile white room. My pride wasn't dead, you see. It was just wounded. And it fought back with the only weapons it had, logic and reason. A hallucination, it whispered. You were in shock, you'd lost a lot of blood. They were pumping you full of a cocktail of painkillers powerful enough to knock out a horse. Of course you saw things. It was a trick of a traumatized brain, a final desperate firing of synapses trying to make sense of the void. And the doctors, with their talk of miracles, they were just being kind. What they really meant was that I was a statistical anomaly, a lucky break. It was skilled surgeons and the simple dumb luck of the impact angle. That's what it was. It had to be, because the alternative was too terrifying to consider. The alternative meant that everything I had become, the bitter, angry man who burned a symbol of his own mother's faith, had been seen. And not just seen, but pitied. And not just pitied, but saved. The thought was so humbling it felt like another kind of death. Sarah brought it to me a few days later after I asked her. She didn't say a word, just placed a small tin box on my bedside table, a box that used to hold butter cookies my grandmother loved. I knew what was inside. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. There it was. A tangled, pathetic mess of blackened plastic and scorched metal. The beads were fused together in ugly clumps. The crucifix was barely recognizable, a dark, twisted shape. This was the reality. This was the evidence of my sin, cold and hard and real. Not the glowing, perfect rosary from the vision. This was ashes and ruin, and for a few hours, my rational mind felt victorious. See? It said. It was a dream. This is what's real. But then, at night, when the hospital was quiet and the morphine drip was low, the other world would return. I wouldn't see her again, not like before. But I would feel the warmth, a profound sense of being, held, cradled. I'd wake up with tears on my face, not from pain, but from a sense of gratitude so overwhelming it felt like a weight on my chest. It's a strange thing, to argue with a memory that feels more real than your own heartbeat. If you've ever had that kind of battle inside yourself, where your head tells you one thing and your heart knows another, do me a favor and hit that like button. Make sure your notifications are on because the end of this fight, well, it changed everything. And with that memory, the shame began to grow. It wasn't a quick hot flash anymore. It was a slow, seeping tide. Lying in that bed, with nothing to do but stare at the ceiling, my past came to visit me. I saw myself not just at the fire pit, but in dozens of other moments. I remembered laughing with one of the guys from the Knights years ago, mocking a family that had set up a small Marian shrine in their front yard. Look at that, I'd said, the old ladies and their magic beads. I remembered a conversation with my sister Mary when she was going through a hard time and said she found comfort in praying the rosary. I told her it was just mindless repetition, that a real, strong faith didn't need crutches like that. Every memory of my own arrogance, my own spiritual pride, was a fresh turn of the knife. I had disdained the very devotion, the very mother that had reached into the darkness to pull me out. The hypocrisy was a physical sickness in my stomach. The man who saw faith as a fortress had been saved by the one part of it he considered a weakness, a sentimentality. Weeks turned into a month. I was home, hobbling around on a cane, my body a roadmap of scars. The silence in the house was different now. It wasn't cold and angry. It was fragile, hesitant. Sarah and I were talking again, but we were like two people learning a new language. One afternoon, she was out at the grocery store, and the house was quiet. The little tin box was on the mantelpiece, a constant, silent accusation. I couldn't stand it anymore. The battle in my head had to end. I grabbed my keys and my cane, and I limped out to my truck. Found myself driving, my hands shaking on the wheel. Not towards the highway, but towards town, towards St. Jude's. I parked in the back where no one would see me. The church was empty on a weekday afternoon. I pushed open the heavy oak door, and the smell hit me first. That familiar scent of old wood beeswax and the faint, lingering ghost of incense. A smell I had once called home, I made my way slowly down the side aisle, my cane thumping softly on the stone floor. I kept my eyes down, afraid to look at the altar, afraid to look at the pew where my family was supposed to be. I felt like a trespasser, a defiler. My goal was a small alcove on the far side of the sanctuary, a place I had probably passed 10,000 times without a second thought. In it was a statue of Mary, life-sized, painted, her hands outstretched. I had always found it a bit gaudy, a little too much. But now I stood before it, leaning heavily on my cane. And I wasn't looking at plaster and paint anymore. The carved face wasn't the face from my vision, but the compassion in the eyes, the gentle tilt of the head. It was a reflection of the mercy I had been shown. It was an echo of that love. And right there, in the silence of the empty church, the fortress of my pride crumbled into dust. My hand, shaking, went into my pocket and pulled out the little tin box. I opened it. And with the statue as my witness, I poured the ashes and the broken, melted beads into my palm. I stared at the wreckage I had made, the symbol of my hate held in the palm of my hand, in the one place I had sworn I would never set foot in again. And for the first time since I was a boy who'd skinned his knee, I stood before my mother. And I wept. Those weren't tears of grief I shed in that church, or even tears of shame, not really. They were tears of relief. The kind a man cries when a weight he didn't even know he was carrying is finally lifted. I knelt there for I don't know how long, with the ashes of my hatred in my palm, until my knees ached and the afternoon sun shifted, sending a beam of light through the stained glass and right onto my hands. It was time to go home. The first thing I did was sit at our kitchen table, the one Sarah and I had bought together 35 years ago, and I poured the contents of that little tin box onto a clean dish towel. It was a pathetic sight, a pile of char and ruin. With a pair of tweezers and a magnifying glass, I began the work. For 3 days I sat at that table, painstakingly separating the melted beads, cleaning the soot from the little silver links, trying to salvage what I could. The grit of the ash was ground deep under my fingernails. My back ached. Sarah would come in and just watch me for a few minutes, her expression unreadable, before quietly placing a cup of coffee beside my elbow. She didn't ask what I was doing. I think she knew. This was my penance. My act of contrition wasn't going to be a few mumbled words in a confessional. It was going to be this: rebuilding, piece by painful piece, what I had so gleefully destroyed. Some of the beads were too far gone, melted into shapeless lumps. The crucifix was bent and blackened, but the form of it was still there. I bought new beads to replace the lost ones, and with a small bottle of superglue and a steady hand, I restrung it. It was ugly, scarred, a Frankenstein's monster of a rosary. But it was whole. It was mine. News travels fast in a small town, and the story of my miraculous survival was already making the rounds. When people started seeing me hobbling back into St. Jude's for daily mass, sitting in the very last pew, my head bowed, the whispers started. They weren't whispers of welcome. They were whispers of suspicion. "Did you hear about John?" they'd say, just loud enough for me to overhear in the grocery store aisle. The accident must have knocked a screw loose. Some were more direct. My old friend from the nights, a man I'd shared 1,000 beers with, pulled me aside after mass one morning. "John, what is all this?" he asked, his face a mixture of concern and pity. "People are saying you're seeing things, that you had some kind of hallucination. It was the trauma, buddy, the morphine. You know that, right?" I just looked him in the eye, my hand instinctively going to the lumpy, scarred rosary in my pocket. I didn't get angry. The old me would have exploded, but the new me just shook my head gently. "It was the most real experience of my life, Tom," I said, and I left it at that. What could I say? How do you explain grace to a man who only deals in facts? How do you describe a love that defies logic? You can't, you can only live it. My sister Mary was the first to truly understand. I went to her house, sat in her kitchen, and I told her everything. The vision, the warmth, the restored rosary in the woman's hands. I pulled my own charred version out of my pocket and laid it on her table. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the melted beads, and she started to cry. But these were different tears than the ones she'd cried on the phone. These were tears of joy. She didn't doubt me for a second. Through her, I found a small prayer group, people who met in the church basement on Tuesday nights. They weren't the pillars of the community. They were the quiet ones, the ones with their own scars, their own stories of being broken and put back together. They didn't care that I was the man from the video. They just saw a man who was searching. And in their company, holding my ugly, beautiful rosary, I began to pray again. Not the rote, mindless prayers of my past, but real conversations. I prayed for Sarah, for Father Michael, for my old friends who thought I was crazy. And most of all, I just said thank you, over and over, thank you. A few months later, the parish was holding its annual fall festival. It was the same festival I used to run, the one where I'd be the big shot barking orders, my name on every banner. This time I was just another face in the crowd, but I knew what I had to do. I had started with a public act of pride. I had to end with a public act of humility. I took out my phone. I went to the same spot in my backyard, by the now cold fire pit. I propped the phone up just like before, but this time when I looked into the lens, there was no anger in my eyes, only tears. "My name is John," I began, my voice thick with emotion. "And many of you know me from another video I made, right here in this spot, a video that came from a place of pride so deep and so dark, it almost cost me everything, my family, my friends, my soul." I paused, taking a shaky breath. I thought my faith was a fortress I had built, but I was wrong. It was a prison. And when I was at my lowest, broken and bleeding on the side of a road, I was saved, not by my strength, not by my legacy, but by the very thing I had mocked. I held up the scarred rosary to the camera. I was saved by a mother's love, by a grace I did not earn and could never deserve. I'm here to ask for forgiveness, from my wife, Sarah, from my family, from Father Michael and my parish, and from all of you for the scandal I caused. The man who burned this rosary is dead. I am what's left, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the second chance I was given. I ended the recording and posted it to the same town Facebook group. Then I turned off my phone, took Sarah's hand, and walked into the festival, no longer a king in a kingdom of ash, but just a grateful son, finally home. My story isn't about changing religions or seeing visions. It's about changing a heart. It's about the terrifying, beautiful truth that mercy can find us even when we're running as fast as we can in the other direction. It's about learning that true strength isn't in the walls we build, but in the courage it takes to let them fall. If this story has reminded you that no one is beyond reach, that even the deepest wounds can be healed, I'd be so grateful if you'd hit that like button and make sure you've turned on your notifications for more stories of hope. And in the comments, I'd be honored if you would share a time when you felt a glimmer of grace in your own life, because in sharing those moments, we remind each other that we are never, ever truly alone. Thank you for listening.